minutes. Good evening, everybody, and welcome again. Can I now call this meeting of the Bibliographical Society to order and welcome you all here again, virtually, online. And once again, after the lecture, we can enjoy breakout rooms, which are randomly allocated so that we can meet up with each other again. And so do stay for that if you can. Can I just, in the way of these things now, just remind you at this stage, if you could please just turn off your cameras, because that saves bandwidth. And I suppose even more importantly, just to remind you to mute yourselves. I also have, just before I introduce the speaker, just to say on a technical note that our speaker has some captions on some of the images, and they might just be hidden if you retain the names and the video shots of the other participants, which are sometimes on the right-hand side of the slides. So just as a tip, to avoid this, you can, if you don't know this, adjust your view by tapping on what might come up as the active speaker view in your video panel. For most of it, I understand, for most of you, I understand this will be the second option from the left. It's not for me, but it might well be for you. The second option from the left is a single solid box, and that might enable you to see the captions more easily. Can I just now ask the secretary, please, to read the minutes of the last meeting of the Society of the 20th of April, 2021.
The sixth meeting of the 128th season took place online via Zoom on Tuesday, the 20th of April. Professor James Raven, President, was in the chair. After the minutes of the previous meeting had been read and signed, the President introduced Dr. Edward Wilson-Lee, who delivered the 2021 Graham Pollard Memorial Lecture entitled Hernando Colón and the Universal Library Machine. When the meeting was open to discussion, the following took part: Professor Nicholas Pickwood, Mr. Edmund King, Professor Gazwan Boutros, Ms. Mary Gavin, and Mr. Robert Laurie. The President thanked Dr. Wilson-Lee warmly for his paper.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask members to confirm that they are a correct record of the meeting? Thank you very much indeed. Now, this evening, everyone, it's our Homee and Phiroze Randeria lecture, a lecture devoted to the history of bookbinding and bookbinders. This year's 2021 Randeria lecture is to be given by Professor Mirjam Foot under the title of New Movements in French 20th Century Binding Design, the Importance of Patronage. Now, I think an introduction to our lecturer is hardly necessary, but for, I suppose, for any member or guest who's been on Mars recently, we are trying to extend our outreach. Let me say that Mirjam worked from 1966 until 1999 in the British Museum, the British Library, latterly as the Director of Preservation and Collection Management, during which time she was responsible for the book moves to St. Pancras. Between 2000 and 2005, she was Professor of Library and Archive Studies at UCL, where she's now Professor Emerita, and has taught at the London Senate House, at Peterhouse in Cambridge, and indeed the Rare Book School at Charlottesville, Virginia. Mirjam's dissensions are, my notes here say that Mirjam's dissensions are legion. Well, they probably are, but actually what I mean to say is Mirjam's distinctions are legion. Let me just mention that she's an honorary fellow of the School of Advanced Studies, University of London, an honorary fellow of Designer Bookbinders, honorary vice president of the Society of Antiquaries, council member of the Association Internationale de Bibliophilie from 1995, and honorary member of the Grolier Club of New York since 2001. And I'm delighted to welcome members of the Grolier Club who are with us tonight. You're really most welcome. In 1997, Mirjam gave the Peninsula Lectures at the British Library, and she was Sanders Reader at Cambridge for 2002 to 3. And of course, she was secretary of this, our society, between 2000 and 2002, and following that, president, and our gold medalist in 2013. Her 8 books include the edited first Randeria volume, and these, together with a great many articles, have made her preeminent in the history of bookbinding, decorated paper, and preservation. So much so, in fact, that she was instrumental in setting up the Randeria lecture series and has given 3 previous Randeria lectures. So, Mirjam, we await your fourth with very great anticipation and very great pleasure.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much. Sorry. I can't do. Trouble is, there is a band above where I want to start my slides.
Click on slideshow, Mirjam.
Yeah, I can't because it's hidden.
Okay.
Oh yes, but
Otherwise, you can click on F5 on your keyboard.
I mean, this easily banned. Can't you get rid of that?
No, does it not? Can we try?
It doesn't work, you see.
No, it doesn't work.
You can move the band to a different position. Move the band
Yeah,
down.
yeah, I've just done that. Yeah, fine, thank you.
Right.
Thank you. Sorry about that. My talk this evening presents a cameo of Paris. Hold on, I'm now not in anymore. Switch myself off. My talk this evening presents a cameo of Paris in the first half of the 20th century, where arts and crafts blossomed, and where we can see something of the relationship between binders and collectors, look at the role patrons played, and see how binders reacted. I want to start with a remarkable man, Jacques Doucet. Sorry. This band needs to be moved, because otherwise I can't do it. Fine. Jacques Doucet did perhaps more than anyone else to inspire, encourage, and guide new movements in design, including binding design. He was a couturier, a collector, and a patron of bindings, but also a patron of all kinds of arts. He tried to inspire, encourage, and guide new movements in design, including binding design. He was born in Paris in February 1853 into a family of artisans and dealers in deluxe objects. His parents had a dressmaking business with a wide clientele. A child of weak health, Jacques was sent to the country, and consequently his academic education suffered. He painted a little, and from the age of 22 worked in the family business until the death of his father in 1898. He continued the business on his own and developed it into what became a well-known house of haute couture. His clientele consisted of the aristocracy, the haute bourgeoisie, and the demi-monde of the theatre. He employed embroiderers, used light floaty fabrics, lace, and pleats. He was an excellent organizer, employing many people, and he was good at spotting talent, something he also applied to other arts and crafts. This, coupled with his wealth, enabled him to become an important patron. His fortune came from his haute couture, and he stayed in charge of the business for most of his life. He was a born collector, starting at the age of 21 with 18th and 19th century paintings, and extending this to other 18th century arts and crafts, such as sculpture, furniture, drawings, porcelain, and books. He employed an architect, interior designer, to build him a large house in the Rue Spontigny in Louis XVI style, designed to show off his collection. And here you see the salon in the Rue Spontigny house, where you can see his 18th century paintings on the wall and some of his 18th century furniture. In 1912, tragedy struck. His muse, a lady much admired and hoped for, died on the evening she at last accepted him. Nothing made sense anymore. Doucet decided to sell his 18th century collection and go abroad. The sale attracted a great deal of attention and fetched more than 13 million francs. The house in the Rue Spontigny became a library, at first with beautiful books in ancient bindings, but then with art books and reference works about art. He also acquired autograph letters and manuscripts by artists, photographs, drawings, and prints. He opened his collection for research, and in 1917-18, he gave his library of art and archaeology to the University of Paris. After the sale of his 18th century art collection, Doucet moved to the Avenue du Bois and completely changed tracks. And in the Avenue du Bois, he devoted most of the last 16 years of his life to contemporary decorative art and literature. And here you can see one of the rooms there with Art Deco furniture, a painting by Leroux and Douanier Rousseau, a painting by Matisse, a painting by Picasso, and modern design furniture specifically designed and made for him. The aftermath of the 1914-18 war had spawned interesting movements both in art, design, and literature. Symbolism, Cubism, Dadaism, and Surrealism all flourished. Doucet was one of the initiators of the style Art Deco, of which he possessed the most representative elements. And we see in this house a mixture of furniture and objects made for him by a number of contemporary artists and designers. The writer André Phiroze, who was a close friend, helped him with collecting modern French literature. Their correspondence bears witness of their shared interest, not only in the contents, but also in the appearance of books. Phiroze wrote, and I quote, that for each book, I would like to note the color and style of the binding, sometimes even the quality of the leather. A bound book is a friend for life. Sewn, it is but a passing acquaintance. Phiroze's advice bore fruit, and modern French binding design was in a way born with Doucet. Doucet complained that if he gave his modern books to the bookbinders in Paris, I quote, they produce complicated, terrible bindings, copies or pastiches of old bindings. This would change when he encountered the interior decorator and designer Pierre Legrain. Legrain was born in 1889 on the outskirts of Paris. He was apparently an obstinate child, finding his school studies too slow and wanting to devote himself to design. He studied art and design at the École Germain-Pilon. For a while, he worked in the atelier of the decorator Paul Iribe, designing dresses and jewelry, fabrics and furniture. He was mobilized in 1914, but was invalided out of the army only 2 years later. He then had no work, but he went to see Jacques Doucet whom he had previously met when working with Iribe. Doucet persuaded Legrand to apply his talents to his library, telling him, "On modern books, I want modern bindings. To date, I've not met anyone who can make them for me. You should apply yourself to this, and that will be very good." Now that's easier said than done, and it is not all that simple to turn one's hands to being a binder. But penury, lack of finding work in his own field, scarcity of suitable materials, lack of clients, and now the promise of a monthly payment of 300 francs made Legrand accept Doucet's offer. It was agreed that Legrand would produce the design models and would then find technicians to execute them. Many bindings designed by Legrand were carried out by the binder René Kieffer. Doucet encouraged Legrand to be more audacious, telling him, I quote, "Seek, work, create. You have my confidence. I believe in your star. Here are new books. Clothe them in modern garments, no pastiches of past time. Don't give the same jacket to Proust as a coat you make for Rimbaud. Borrow from contemporary painters their mosaics in vivid colors, their shapes, lines, ribbons. Do you like gold? Use it." For the next 2 years, Legrand designed decorated bindings for Doucet and discovered his own love of books. Between 1917 and 1919, he produced about 370 designs. A new style appeared, changing the traditional approach to books and bindings. Legrand realized not only the possibilities, but also the limits of what could be done with the binding. He was aware that restraint was more effective than overloading. He wanted simplicity, hints of subtle thought revealed in simple forms. He fulminated against the traditional dentelles, flowers, and complex mosaics, preferring contemporary aesthetics. His early bindings show designs achieved with a ruler, a square, and dividers, and have an architectural quality. They were not universally admired. Marius Michel, who himself had broken away from tradition about 1900, rejecting pastiche for floral mosaics, revolted. I quote, "Where are we going? Now, if a rule and a pair of dividers are enough to make a decoration, yes, where are we going?" Indeed, Legrand's binding designs caused a radical reformation. He incorporated the spine to create a unity of decoration together with both covers. He used inlays and onlays to create depth. As well as goatskin, for which he had a preference, he said goatskin is king. He also used other leathers, such as fish skin and snake skin, and had these tooled in gold, palladium, or blind. He also used sheet metal, wood, ivory, lacquer, and mother of pearl, as you see inlaid in this binding. His designs were frequently not centered, and he often put elements of the design at the outer edges of the covers. He also often put the author's name and/or the title on the upper cover, and he used letters as decoration inspired by typography. He wanted to link the text or the illustration to the designs for the bindings. Legrand felt that the binding needed to prepare the reader for the contents of the book. I quote, "In my view, a binding is in itself not significant. The cover of a book is but the frontispiece that takes on the spirit of and prepares us for the text by its choice of nuance and style. However, his designs also made a different approach necessary for the finishers who carried them out. They felt compelled to make plaques of a quarter or half of Legrand's design and then use the blocking press. Legrand did not like the result and turned to different workmen, such as André Jeanne, who could tool his designs by hand with remarkable results. Legrand moved his atelier several times, settling in 1926 in the Place de Val-de-Grâce, where, having come to grips with the necessary knowledge of forwarding and finishing, all processes, or still carried out by others, were then under his own control and made according to his very high standards. It was here that he produced his most famous bindings. As well as making bindings, furniture, and objects of art for Doucet, Legrand also made several frames for Doucet's collection of modern paintings. And he designed the emblem of a cat for Doucet, referring to La Fontaine's fable of Le Cochet, Le Chat et le Souriceau. And I got to quote this in French. Mon fils, dit la souris, ce Doucet est un chat. My son, said the mouse, that soft creature is a cat. Whether this apt comparison referred to Doucet's critical faculties hidden behind his self-effacing and liberal attitude, or whether it referred to his love of the aesthetic and beautiful, I leave it to you to judge. On the 27th of July, 1929, Legrand died of a heart attack. He had created a new style, and his work is characterized by taste, audacity, intelligence, and a sense of perfection. Traditional decoration had been turned upside down thanks to these first experiments inspired by Doucet. Later, his predilection for a young binder, Rose Adler, whom he had discovered at an exhibition in 1923, showed again his flair in spotting talent. Doucet liked her work and ordered 3 bindings from her. He also invited her to his library. She became a close friend and worked for him until his death. Rose Adler was born in Paris in 1890. From 1917 till 1925, she attended the École de l'Union Centrale des Arts Décoratifs and took private lessons in finishing from Henri Nouillac. Rose lived in the Rue Cardinet in Paris and stayed there until June 1940. And here you see a photograph of her apartment taken in 1935. Through Doucet, Rose Adler met Pierre Legrand, whom she admired and under whose influence she fell, using abstract forms in a spirit of interpretation of freedom. But her work was less cubist, more natural, and she used a great variety of colors and materials. Doucet encouraged her to be audacious, and under his influence, her bindings changed in style. He gave her several of his most splendid and most loved books to bind, texts that inspired her to do her best work. And here you see a binding by her on the work by André Gide, and here one on the work by Paul Valéry. And both Gide and Valéry were authors that Doucet collected. And there are many more examples. Rose was knowledgeable about materials. She liked carve, the typically French fine box carve that you see here, but she also used other kinds of materials and other leathers. She used snake skin and crocodile skin, which you see here. And she used unusual materials such as wood fibers, papers of different kinds, and she made mosaics using palladium and aluminium for tooling or for inlaid fillets. Doucet also asked her to make frames for his paintings and furniture, and she made several stools for him and several frames for his paintings, and she kept an account book in which she wrote down what she did for him with the price, which is most interesting. She did a great deal of work for Doucet during his later years, and there are all but 150 bindings by her in Doucet's Bibliothèque littéraire. Rose was a beautiful young woman. She was humorous and cheerful, providing youthful grace and laughter for this by then old Maecenas. Was this une amitié amoureuse? In any case, she illuminated Doucet's last years and was devastated when he died. Her journal, a diary which she kept from 1927 till 1959, is full of Doucet, and his memory and influence remained with her all her. We go back a few years. In 1928, Doucet had moved into his studio in Neuilly. This studio was also filled with modern art and furniture designed for him, and he asked Legrand to arrange the paintings and the furniture in such a way that the studio did not become a museum, but a place to live, creating a precarious balance between respectful proximity to and usability of arts and crafts. But although Legrand arranged it, it was still the collector himself who conceived the project, oversaw every detail, and gave directions to a small group of artists and artisans who carried out the work. Among the furniture was a stool by Legrand, which you see here. He also made 2 lacquered wardrobes, a desk of ebony, and a wall cabinet for Doucet. In his furniture and his furniture designs, Legrand was quite clearly influenced both by Cubist art, but also by African art, in the materials he used as well as in the shapes. He may well have become familiar with African art in some of the Paris galleries, where this was very fashionable at the time. Legrand's death in July 1929 cast a heavy shadow over Doucet's last months. The effect of moving, fitting out a new studio with furniture, paintings, and sculpture made and decorated by artists may have been too much for a man well in his 70s. His mind was always moving on and towards something new. His body perhaps unable to keep up. On the 30th of October, 1929, he suffered a major heart attack and died. His Bibliothèque littéraire went to the University of Paris to join his library on art and archaeology. Rose Adler's journal starting with two short entries in 1927 and 1928, took off after Doucet's death with long entries dating from November 1929 and continuing until February 1959, shortly before her own death. She noted significant events, meeting with friends and with her collaborators. She mentioned openings of exhibitions, in many of which she participated, and she wrote down her thoughts and some personal reflections. It's a witness of a world that was disappearing, the Paris art world, in which she remained active. She knew a large number of artists of all kinds, book and art dealers, collectors, and bibliophiles. The early years of the journal are full of references to Doucet. She paid frequent visits to his tomb and remained close to him in spirit, trying to keep his memory, his principles, taste, and vision alive. An entry dating March 1930 reads, "He continues to be my mirror and my inspiration. I try to realize what he hoped for me." And a year later we read, "For me, he was the only one, the best." She remained a great admirer of Pierre Legrain, frequently taking flowers to his grave, as she did to that of Doucet, and comparing, in 1930, Legrain's work, posthumously exhibited at the Union des Artistes Modernes, you see here the catalogue, with that of lesser designers. And she wrote, "Legrain stands out, overtakes others with the nobility of his studied refinement, with his materials and the use made of the materials, imagination, beautiful style. But nothing approaches in this retrospective exhibition the furniture and the beautiful objects made in collaboration with Jacques Doucet." Rose Adler's own work can be divided into three periods. From 1924 till 1929, when she worked for Doucet, and when Legrain's influence was most marked. And you see here a book that she bound in 1928 during this period, signed it with the date. Then, from 1929 to 1939, she worked for the Fondation Littéraire Jacques Doucet and for several other French and also foreign collectors, using figurative as well as abstract decoration. And here you see one of this period, again signed by her with the date 1938. She exhibited widely, both in Paris and also abroad. In November 1932, she organized an exhibition of her own work and of that of friends in her own apartment. And this is a photograph taken of that exhibition. And you can just make out some bindings. There's one here, there are a couple on the chimney piece, there's one there are a couple in the hearth, and some on the tables. Her love and sense of color shines throughout her journal. When she refurbished her apartment, she only talked about the various colors she had chosen. And this love of colors is manifest in all her creations. And many of her bindings are very colorful with a great sense of a combination of colors. By this time, she no longer manufactured her own bindings, but used collaborators, finishers, and forwarders, mainly employing André Jeanne, who frequently co-signed Rose Adler's bindings. Here you can see the signature of André Jeanne, and it says d'or, meaning d'horreur, finisher, on the doublure of one of the books she bound. The Second World War had changed Rose Adler's working conditions. Materials were costly and hard to come by. Her rich clients no longer had the means to buy her work. But although the environment had changed, she still got individual commissions. But the odds were against realizing large orders. From 1945, she started a new phase. Her bindings became simpler, more and more refined, and the materials more and more subtle. She employed deerskin, cork, as you can see here, 2 cork onlays, paper, and wood. In a letter of 1946, she described how she had changed her way of working. I quote, "I've been drawing a lot and I've adopted a new method. Instead of focusing on an object and thereby constraining it, I note all possibilities that come with me while drawing, all shapes and color combinations, using pencils and cut out pieces of paper. At the end of an afternoon, I have so much to choose from, so much to draw on for other orders beyond what I'm looking for. And it's less depressing, causes less anxiety than telling myself that I will never find the right solution." Orders were now again coming in, and we read, "My order book is impressive, and I feel that these new clients come to me with sympathy. I wish the days were longer, but where can I find the leather? I would like several sheets of Japon paper and sheets of pink vellum. I have found a few leaves of Japon nacre, which is a pearly translucent Japanese vellum. Oh," she says, "how beautiful." By the end of 1946, Rose started to prepare for an exhibition at Bibliothèque Nationale to be held in May 1947. I quote, "I've made great efforts searching for designs and have managed to get leather, parchment, etc. Maybe in Nancy they have very thin leather to line my boxes. I have managed to get a kind of glove leather in white." But she sometimes got discouraged. "I've worked so hard and I cannot count on success. I'm 5 years behind the other exhibitors and I cannot obtain anything from the finishers who have far too many orders." After the war, the whole artistic climate in Paris had changed. She writes, "Many people have lost their feeling of magic for words and only pick at a time. Time is too short for all we want to do." Rose was not the only designer of bindings who suffered from lack of materials and lack of interest. Routine binding production immediately after the end of the war was essentially limited to Jansenist bindings or half bindings. On the other hand, the artists were still around, but their activity was held back by the lack of demand for artist-designed bindings. It was at this time, in 1945, that Paul Bonnet, another of the major figures in this field, met Julien Quin, the administrateur général of the Bibliothèque Nationale, and pointed out to him that the art of bookbinding, he says so typically French since the 16th century, was disappearing, and that in his view, the Bibliothèque Nationale could and should help artistic creativity in this field. Julien Quin was interested, and after long discussions, they concluded that it was necessary to develop a taste for and an understanding of high-quality binding. This led to the establishment of La Société de la Reliure Originale, an organization of people who were interested in bookbinding, essentially binders, bibliophiles, and booksellers. Bonnet chose 6 binders, each of whom would be asked to name clients and bibliophiles who would be prepared to lend their support. Only 16 of those came forward. Rose Adler was one of the founder members and regularly showed her bindings at the Society's exhibition. In her journal, Rose commented on her fellow artists and designers. On Paul Bonnet, she wrote, "In binding, he is the only one who looks to go further. Sometimes he succeeds. Sometimes he drowns in bad taste. I'm not sure whether he realizes that. He's not a bad character, but he's heavy, self-sufficient, and he's too interested in himself. He defends himself and is frightened to be brought down to the same level as the copiers and the followers of other designers. And he wanted to impose space between them and himself in the exhibition. I think that it is the work itself that should radiate with such superiority that it leaves the others in the shade." Paul Bonnet was born in Paris on the 15th of February, 1889, to Belgian parents. From 1904 to 1906, he was apprenticed to an electrician. He worked as an assistant in his mother's hat shop, but being more interested in art and design and wanting to become a painter, he first started to make hats himself and then became a dress designer. He joined the army in 1914, but was wounded and demobilized. In 1920, he entrusted some of his own books for binding to 2 ladies who kept a paper shop and also did some binding. But not liking their banal decoration, he decided to design his own, making models and having them executed by trained craftsmen. He met several teachers at the École Estienne and went to classes on finishing. He took part in exhibitions where his bindings were unnoticed or met with general indifference. About to give up, luck struck in a meeting with his first client, Monsieur Marty, for whom he worked for 2 years, from 1927 to 1929. During this period, he designed this binding for the Houville La Diadème de Fleurs. 3 copies of this book, bound by Bonnet, are mentioned in his carnet. His carnet is essentially an account book, but with many comments, not only telling him for whom the binding is made, but what he used, what he thinks himself about the designs, and of course what he charges for it. He kept this account book from 1924 till 1971. He also designed the binding for Proust à la recherche du temps perdu in 13 volumes, a work that he bound at least 5 times between 1928 and 1951. And this set, the volume of which you see here, with a design that is basically the same for each volume, is described in his carnet, remarking, "I believe the irradiating theme suits this work. The final composition drawing to a close on Le Temps Retrouvé, which is the last volume." He then decided to give up his job of hat maker and devote himself entirely to designing bindings. Early on, he was inspired by Pierre Legrain, but he moved away from Legrain's influence and by 1930 had established himself as a leading designer of book bindings, using new techniques and materials such as sculpted or molded and pierced leather. He used inlays as well as onlays, tooled in gold, blind, palladium, or aluminium. This is a book that he bound for his first patron, and all the silvery bits you see here are in fact aluminium. He employed various craftsmen to carry out his designs, demanding technical virtuosity and precision. He had the ability to interpret the same book in different ways, but he also used the same design a number of times, both for the same book, but also for different books, claiming that his designs were not so much connected to the text, and believing that variations on the same theme therefore did not make the results dull. A view that was clearly not shared either by Pierre Legrain or by Rose Adler. He now got more commissions and took part in a number of exhibitions in Paris, as well as in Brussels, in Copenhagen, and elsewhere. When the war broke out, commissions became scarce. He turned his hand to cartonnage d'éditeur, publishers' bindings for Gallimard, one of which you see here. But then quite soon again returned to making series of designs for the same book. His first binding for Deux des Tartarins de Tarascon was made in 1941. But once the war was over, his commissions restarted. And between 1945 and 1969, he designed the bindings for 28 copies of this book, many with a lion's mask, as you see here, carried out in slight variations, with or without stars, with more or fewer gold lines, and with the onlays in differently deployed colors. This particular example belongs to the Wormsley Library. An early copy is at Trinity College, Cambridge. And I'm very grateful to Nicholas for providing me with this splendid photograph, which is much better than the one I took myself. And you see here, it's still an early one where only the eyes of the lion have been onlaid and the rest is all in gold tooling. But the copy you see here was number 21, and he commented on this particular binding in his carnet. As I've already stated, certain of my themes are now linked to the books, but I believe that the variations do not make my products heavy. This copy, by the by, belonged to the Henry Davis gift and is now in the British Library. Bonnet was a remarkably versatile designer, experimenting with every artistic style of the 20th century. Perhaps his best known design is the sunburst, with gold-tooled crossing and intersecting lines radiating from a set of prominent onlays. The first one was made in 1942, but he produced several variants over at least 20 years, and certainly not all on the same book. This splendid example on André Suarez Cirque is in the Wormsley Library. And this example on Paul Valéry is again part of the Henry Davis gift to the British Library. Bonnet frequently used onlays to different effects. Here in a harmony of grey and white with small touches of color on the Montalin's Mors et Vita. His bindings were in demand and his fame spread. In 1951, he became a Chevalier of the Légion d'honneur, and in the same year, he was awarded the first prize in an international bookbinding competition organized by Hatchard. He died on the 3rd of March, 1971. In his eulogy at Bonnet's funeral, Jacques Millot placed some of Bonnet's most masterly pieces on the same niveau as the most prized contemporary paintings. If one considers that Picasso was one of them, this is praise indeed. Millot called Bonnet as a person, I quote, not inferior to his role as an artist. Not everyone would have agreed with that. Rose Adler's journal tells a different story. In 1958, she wrote, Paul Bonnet is a lone knight in his self-sufficiency. He has put himself on a level with Picasso and Matisse. He's a brave character. He makes mistakes without suffering from them. He is so sure that he's right. There is not a shadow of self-doubt. He beats a large drum and stifles the sound of a flute that one may want to hear. He stifles it with a vulgar stream of words that the bibliophilic public encourages. But she did stress that Bonnet's bindings were, I quote, of an enormous imagination, calling his work a kind of Baroque art, flamboyant. In the same year as Paul Bonnet, Rose Adler too became a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor, having reached the summit of her career. The book dealers Georges Elbrun and Pierre Berès commissioned and sold her work. They also brought her in contact with other bibliophiles and collectors. Colonel Daniel Sickles, for whom she bound this copy of Gilbert Voisin, Page à mon goût, was one. This is his bookplate, incidentally. He was a voracious collector, amassing several collections which were sold at different times. He collected modern French illustrated books and modern bindings, but his character left a certain amount to be desired. Neither Rose Adler nor Georges Elbrun thought much of Sickles' discernment. When Rose asked Elbrun what Sickles thought of her binding on Colette, Elbrun reported, he had not realized how successful it was until I admired the binding. Then he said, yes, but she's very expensive. This has cost me 50,000 francs. Elbrun had warned Rose against this collector. I quote, he's a gangster, but he has his ardor for a beautiful piece, a beautiful object, a sense of harmony, which makes us, perhaps wrongly, indulgent. It is curious one can have such a perfect aesthetic sense while lacking all scruples. But he is scrupulous when money and the power of money are concerned. Rose had her own problems with Sickles. I quote, paying is problematic with Sickles. And she wrote, Sickles has not paid. He telephones me from time to time to say that he has not forgotten it, but he has not paid. A more amenable collector who took a great interest in Rose Adler's work was a new Greek client whom she had met immediately after the war and who had ordered 28 bindings. In a letter of 1946, she described him as very beautiful, very young, snob, an Oriental Prince Charming who brings books that Doucet could have chosen. Surely that was the highest price. This was André Rodekanaki. He was of Greek origin. He was born in Paris in 1914. He started collecting books in the early 1930s and was attracted by their appearance. He later said himself that he had spent too little time studying the history of binding, but bindings were a constant interest in his collecting. He wrote, a book is not a finished object without its binding. And this proposition can also be turned round in that the amount of interest raised by the binding attracts the collector to its contents. When assembling a library where bindings played an essential role, he would always respect the original binding, however humble, but he did commission bindings, and he felt that there might be a struggle between the taste of the collector and the freedom of inspiration of the designer. Cost could also be an issue, and he encouraged binders to look for less expensive materials and techniques. Rodekenacki used to collect historic bindings, but since the end of the Second World War, he embraced modern binding design. His first commission in 1944 was to Paul Bonnet, and a little later, when he met Rose Adler, her delicate and generous personality seduced him. He called her the spiritual daughter of Pierre Legrain. These are 4 simple bindings she made for him. Rodekenacki played an important part in La Reliure Originale, being one of the 16 bibliophiles invited to support that organization at its foundation and becoming its first president. He tried to forge a close collaboration between binders, curators, booksellers, and collectors, and encouraged younger binders to flourish. The first exhibition of La Reliure Originale was held in 1947 in the Bibliothèque Nationale, and copy number 1 of the catalogue was printed for André Rodekenacki and bound cooperatively by 5 foundation members for their president. It's in black goatskin, lined with red calf, onlaid and tooled. The upper cover was designed by Rose Adler, the lower cover by Henri Creusevaux. The doublure was designed by Georges Crotet, and the end leaves respectively by Paul Bonnet and Robert Bonfils. As well as organizing many exhibitions in France and abroad, La Reliure Originale instituted a prize consisting of a commission to design and bind a book for the Bibliothèque Nationale. It was paid for by the society. The first time this prize was awarded in 1948, it was won by Pierre-Lucien Martin, who later became a member, the first binder to be co-opted since its foundation, and who became one of the best and most influential binders of his generation. This is one of his splendid ones. He's my favorite binder, but I fear there is no time to talk about him tonight. Paris, during the first half of the 20th century, was quite obviously a hothouse of art and design. Poetry, literature, painting, sculpture, decorative art, and design all flourished, and their creators seem to have formed a close community of friends and rivals. Much seemed to have had its impetus in the energy and taste of Jacques Doucet, and it was him I would like to finish. He surrounded himself with young artists of every kind, enabling them to develop and freely exercise their talents. And he brought binding design into this wider world, showing that it can move outside the discipline of book history, in which we have largely consigned and confined it, into cultural history at its widest sense. Thank you.
Mirjam, thank you. Mirjam, thank you so much for that marvelous lecture.